Hey everyone, John with Hardline here. This video is going to be a bit more of an informal talk than usual, but I've been doing some reading lately and figured this would be interesting to talk about. So, if you're an outdoorsman and you spend a good bit of time on the internet reading about outdoor related activities, it's only so long before you find yourself encountering people who call themselves preppers. Now, these people tend to be found in online forums, review sections, and media areas that cover anything to do with wilderness skills, bushcraft, tools, and other kind of outdoor related activities. Obviously, they have other things that they talk about, but it's a common interest that, people who like camping and people who call themselves preppers know about things like good boots, good backpacks, and good pocket tools. So something that I found reading about these types of people, because obviously you bump into them, you hear what they have to say, and sometimes are curious and want to learn a little bit more, is that first off, there are a few very common misconceptions about the subculture, as well as a few lessons that they might actually have that could turn out to be very useful outside of preparing for some kind of mass issue. So first off, I just want to cover a little bit of the popular misconception is basically if you've heard about preppers or prepping or these kinds of people from popular mainstream media, outside of the places that they tend to frequent, you probably would have heard of things like Doomsday Preppers, the Discovery Channel show. And it basically depicts this group as, a bunch of eccentrics, let's just say, who are preparing for the end of the world as we know it, so to speak, from any range of unreasonably peculiar and unlikely scenarios. We hear about things like the nuclear wars or zombies or some other almost nonsensical thing happening. Now, while there are some people in the community who do talk about those kinds of things, for the most part, people are talking about immediate disaster preparedness, economic insecurity, and or widespread civil unrest, or other more realistic things that can either be short-term and local in nature, or long-term and widespread in nature. So just to cover a bit of an idea of what the more normal type of prepper would talk about, I'll just give a little bit of an example. Basically, I live in northern Alberta. Basically, that's a central flyover state of Canada. And just north of the city I'm in, now just north, it's about an 8-hour drive, but over here we call that next door, a set of wildfires actually managed to get big enough to force an evacuation of the town. Now, what a lot of people had to do was basically pack up their valuables, or at least as much as they could fit in their cars, and travel to Edmonton, the city I live in, to stay in hotels until the fires went out. Among those people, some chose to or were forced to flee farther north, basically either because of traffic conditions or roads being blocked by fallen trees and fires themselves, and spend the duration of the disaster in northern Alberta, which basically past Fort McMurray, which is an industrial outpost at most. There's not a lot of hotels, not a lot of gas stations. There are small towns, but they're not really equipped to handle a major influx of people who are essentially refugees, or at least short-term refugees. And of the people who fled north, those who would have in some ways fallen into the category of preppers were fairly minimally affected by the disaster, right? Obviously, their houses were threatened. Some of them did lose their houses and substantial amounts of valuables, but among them, plenty had good insurance policies, and they had a lot of their valuables in fire safes and things like that. So the people who prepared for this obviously prepared for something realistic that could happen in their area given the hot, dry summers despite cold winters and abundance of forest nearby. So the people who were most prepared basically had the skills and tools to go up north, camp for a couple weeks. Obviously, it's fire season, so it's summer, and come back to hopefully a fairly unscathed house. So that's kind of the normal description of what a prepper is. And obviously, there's people who are worried about much more widespread things. And something I found that's actually could be quite useful from the community as a whole They're mostly an internet community, but obviously there are people who know each other in the physical world who call themselves a part of it and who organize together as a part of it, is that when they do talk about potential major, wide-scale, long-term problems, they also speculate about how they would want to rebuild. Most of these people are pro-modernity, pro-technology, and pro-civilization, contrary to what popular belief would suggest. And so things like TVs, computers, cars, heated houses, safety, are all things they value and want to be able to maintain, but they often imagine how they would maintain these things in a world with less inherent stability and less abundant resources. Basically, if you have an economic disaster where, some major part of the world economy is affected, how would you keep all of the amenities of modern life up and running as we have them today, despite those more challenging circumstances? So basically, I took this into some serious consideration and thought, well, what do they think we should do, or they should do once they've gotten through, the hardest parts of things going sideways? And does that plan realistically work and or follow a format that could be implemented today without any kind of disaster predicating it? And what I found is that in a lot of ways, it would actually be easier to rebuild things in the way they're describing without anything collapsing in the first place. And not only would it be easier now than later, if indeed their predictions are true, but in a lot of ways, it could make things more sustainable and stable, more desirable, and that with modern technology, it's in a lot of ways easier now than it would have ever been, and especially than, say, 20 years ago. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about what their vision is, so to speak. I'm not going to claim any original thought on this. I've mostly just read about it and evaluated it, what its benefits are, and how we might go about that if, we decided to, say, not rebuild, but proactively construct this future that I've read about. So basically what their vision is that for the most part, life and culture would exist how it does today. You'd still have entertainment, recreation, work in a recognizable format and all the science we have today. But the main response to basically make things more efficient in eyes of resource shortage and more stable in eyes of reduced external stability would be by decentralizing things. So basically moving away from major cities, which are big importers of resources and exporters of services, into smaller towns. And when I say small towns, I don't mean like 100-person villages or, tiny little outposts. I'm talking like, pretty big places. 20,000, 50,000 people are all completely realistic numbers for people in an urban center that is almost entirely self-sustaining. And then despite more local autonomy and independence, still engaging in regional trade and communication with other communities abroad. Not necessarily abroad overseas, but upstate, downstate, whichever direction you want to go. So basically, to summarize, you'd have smaller cities, right? I'm talking under 100,000, but usually over 20,000. Total independence for life-sustaining resources. So basically things like power and food are all sourced locally. And then continuing trade. So maintaining imports and exports of valuable but non-essential goods and services, as well as maintaining open communication and diplomacy. You hear about and know about what people are doing one town down the road or even across the world, but aren't necessarily dependent. To first cover whether or not this is even possible, I did a little bit of math on North America. Now, the same math would technically apply everywhere but Europe. Sorry to say, but this won't work without a lot of people leaving Europe. It's just too densely populated there. But in North America and every other continent, say you were to take all the big cities and have everyone just kind of over time move out of them into smaller towns, then each town could have at least 20 square miles of space in its backyard. So basically outside of township limits, but basically in the nearby rural area, which depending on food technology, can sustain as many as 130,000 people, depending on how much sun you get, using only half of that space. So basically, if you have a town of, say, 30,000, which is bigger than I actually used for the calculation, so again, you could have smaller ones and bigger ones, you would only need to use half or less of the free real estate outside of town for crops. And so that'd leave easily 10 square miles or so of basically recreational space, which as an outdoorsman, I think would be rather nice to have. And to any non-outdoors people listening to this, until you've tried things like hiking, camping, and biking, all those types of activities, it's hard to speak for whether you would like them or not, but generally for people who've tried them, they have fairly universal appeal. And obviously none of this counteracts an area's ability to have something like a movie theater. So when we have basically established, in theory, it's possible for people to live in smaller towns that are more spread out and more autonomous, given current populations, again, all of this so far is perfectly sustainable. We also have a few other boosts to sustainability. And in some, basically, it includes less shipping costs, less conflict of interest, and a slower kind of natural growth of federal and regional governments. And basically, the reason this would be is because obviously if you're making more things locally, you have to import and export less. And while this might mean a smaller net amount of trade in the economy, right? When we measure GDP, we include things going in both directions. It would mean less, basically, pollution, because obviously shipping takes energy, and most of that energy comes from fossil fuels, as well as more stability. Basically, a ship that has to cross an ocean to bring in your tools is subject to the whims of both nature and any federal governments that it has to cross paths with. So obviously, if you make something locally, you can more easily guarantee that it will be there when you want or need it. In terms of conflicts of interest, you can just look at the state of affairs right now, where almost every major conflict that's currently going on is in some way or another a conflict over resources. Of course, there are different types, but a lot of times when there's either a soft or hard political conflict, it's when two parties want the same resource. And since the Second World War, those resources have usually been far away from the home states. I won't take a strong stance on whether all the wars in the Middle East right now really are over just oil, because obviously some people have other theories on what they're about, whether it's regional dominance by Iran or someone else or what. But if foreign parties didn't have as much stake in the issue, they wouldn't be fanning the flames as much, so to speak. Now, obviously, a counter-argument would be, well, if no one cares whether a conflict happens, who can go and be a peacekeeper? But at the same time, peacekeepers have a fairly mixed review these days about whether or not they're actually effective. So moving on from conflict of interests, again, we have the natural limiting of government size. Now, I'm saying this as basically what you'd call a small government liberal, not an extremist in any direction or another, but I do fairly firmly believe that massive governments make for similarly sized stressors, right? I know the biggest conflicts of human history were between not just major federal governments, but major factions working together. The Allies and the Axis were basically the world split in two twice, and the Cold War, arguably the most stressful but smallest body count war we've had in a long time, was again between two enormous factions. So obviously when you have a huge amount of regional interdependence, you need a regional mediator to make sure that any conflict of interest that happens between, say, two cities in a state or two states in a country needs to be able to step in and resolve that. To anyone who's shared a kitchen or a car before, even people who want to get along, when they share an essential good or resource, will come into conflict. So those are the main kind of issues on sustainability, right? We have naturally smaller government because people don't need as big of one, right? It's not so much ideological as it is practical. Less conflict of interest because, again, areas don't depend on imports and exports from one another. And lower shipping costs, which obviously shipping routes are both a risk and an expense. So now moving into the next section on desirability, basically we have 5 major factors. We have better cohesion, more natural areas, more local freedoms, ease of diplomacy, and easier migration. So the first one, cohesion, should be pretty simple. Basically, people move to a town. Usually, again, when I say town, I mean a city with less than, say, 100,000 people. They still feel like cities, but you usually go to a town for some specific reason or another. Either it's the local industry or the local culture, or one of only a few major companies there, or the local geography. With that being said, people who move to smaller towns, by virtue of choosing one rather than another, right? Say you were to split one city in 10, you'd still have to pick between the 10 which one was your favorite. Those people will have more in common. And with commonality comes cohesion. Now, not automatically, right? People might still have conflicts of interests locally. There might be different local cultures, but this is noticeably and measurably lower with a smaller regional community size. Now moving to natural area. Again, this is something that I did a little bit of math on earlier, but basically if you spread everyone out in still urban centers, right? Like there'd still be apartments and all those things. And again, it sounds like I might be talking about this as though it had happened by a plan, but again, this is one of those things that I think with the right cultural seed, the market would provide. If you took all those cities and spread them out with similar density at their cores, you could have much more close and easily accessible natural area to all of them. Just using the province of British Columbia in Canada, for example, now it's lower in population than most American states are, but its populace is mostly concentrated in one city, that's Vancouver, with a few small towns here and there. Now, the province is actually huge, and if you were to divide Vancouver, which I think right now has like 5 million people in it, into 50 towns, then place those 50 towns moderately evenly throughout the province, each town would still have a massive amount of space nearby that, people could go mountaineering in and all those things, or just build hockey arenas in, depending on what they were into, and be able to drive to it or walk to it easily, because again, crossing Vancouver can easily take an hour and a half by car, when if you start at the edge of the city, you can get, easily 150 miles from it in that same amount of time. Now, with a small town, the time it takes to cross it is significantly reduced, right? Because again, the urban center just isn't as big of a place to cross. Now moving on to local freedoms, this is an extension of conflict of interests, where if smaller areas were more autonomous, or more areas that were still pretty big were more autonomous, people wouldn't need to agree on as many of the kind of nitpicky cultural laws that have sort of come into vogue these days. Obviously, some people would have a problem with the idea of some areas doing things that they didn't find morally agreeable, but there would always be the option of people who didn't like those rules leaving those places. And at the same time, if those two areas, the one with one moral set and the one with another moral set, have to share a federal legal system, then they'll still always be at ends with one another, because neither side has the autonomy or the power, so to speak, to set its own rules how it wants, right? Let's just use the example of same-sex marriage. Personally, I don't see any reason not to allow it, but obviously there are other people who do. If you have one town that likes it and one town that doesn't, and they have to agree, there are going to be unhappy parties no matter what. And the unhappy party is going to be, in both cases, the majority of people in whichever city is smaller. Now, give both of those cities regional autonomy, and the only people who are bothered would be those who are disturbed that the place nearby has different rules from them, or people for whom it's too inconvenient to move to the more or less liberal city. So obviously there is a cost to this difference, but it's one that provides the greatest benefit, so to speak, to the greatest number of people, given the assumption that people know what's best for them. So now moving on, that would also add to diplomatic ease. Again, regions having to share a lot of both resources and rules means that diplomacy has more at stake and is more challenging. And I'm just adding this to the desirability section mainly because when I talk about sustainability, I'm talking about avoiding things like, famines and wars. But when there's less diplomatic strain, people are also just less stressed out. A lot of times diplomatic negotiations involve things that reduce people's quality of life on both sides. A good example is a debate over a pipeline between my province and a neighboring province that eventually entailed a wine ban where my province wasn't allowed to buy wine from the neighbor. This hurt winemakers over there and wine enjoyers over here, and in many ways reduced people's contentness with the system as a whole over an almost unrelated issue. Now, in terms of desirability, this is the last point and also quite possibly the most counterintuitive, and it's that with more local independence, migration would actually become easier. Now, this sounds like the opposite of what people would expect, because obviously if, let's say, each state or each city had the freedom to decide whether or not they want to allow immigrants, then everyone just wouldn't allow people in. But when you look at the debate at the federal level, the only reason it's controversial at all right now is because people are actually pretty split down the middle about whether they want to let new people into their region or not. Good examples, the Texas-California debate. Again, there's lots of individuals who fall outside of this trend, but California seems to want more people from outside of the US, and Texas seems to want less. If one side or the other wins out in this debate, either the people who want less will be unhappy or the people who want more will be unhappy. If you let each state decide independently, then basically the side that wants to let people in will be able to, and the side that wants to be able to keep people out will be able to as well. This has a noticeable geographic divide to it, and the area that wants to let new people in is also the area that'll be more welcoming to them. So given people were able to cross the southern border of the United States in the first place, they would most likely go to California rather than Texas anyways. So by letting the regions, again in the smaller situation this way, decide what they want to do, more people are able to move in general and in total. Same rule would apply for Canada or any other state in the US. The only challenge here is that in some ways it seems like it would cause quite a bit of a logistic burden, because say you can get a New Mexico green card that only applies to New Mexico. Now it should make it challenging for a person to either be kept out of the rest of the states or basically be able to go to states that are friendly to them. Now, obviously this one, when it comes to other laws and how they come into play, would be much less challenging than it sounds. Having a green card is required if you want to legally work for an employer. The states that are allowing people in or would want to allow people in are the ones that have open positions for work. So if you had a state-only immigration permit, be it temporary or involving full local citizenship, then you can either work illegally in a place outside of that state, which risks a penalty but might be hard to enforce, or you can work entirely legally in the place that perceives itself to have a demand for workers. So obviously the place with more work is also the one you can work in legally. There's not a lot of incentive to go elsewhere, given that you've entered the region as a whole legally in the first place and are trying to follow laws. So that closes out the section on desirability for the most part and kind of gives us a little bit of a transition into the ease section. Talking about enforcing migration laws state by state rather than federally was a little bit of a preface to this, but basically this is a little bit more on technology. And so to start, the main factors are basically communication technology, digital industries, local manufacturing, and local logistics. So basically to start, it's easier now than ever to communicate with people at distance. Now obviously people still like to meet in person, but for business reasons, cultural reasons, or any other set of reasons, if you choose to live 100 rather than 1 mile from the city core that you would consider yourself most interested in, either keeping up with culturally or working with, then that 100-kilometer barrier is much smaller now that we have things like internet communication rather than just post and telephone, right? It's all instantaneous now, and while certain parts of the world have faster internet connection, it doesn't make any noticeable difference whether an email or a Skype call needs to go 1 mile or 30. Because again, I'm not talking about people moving to the Arctic or anything like that. I'm just talking about spreading out into smaller towns, which right now are actually extremely cheap. I was just shopping for a house for my uncle, actually. He's getting old and having Alzheimer's, and so he's trying to move to a new house closer to a hospital and basic services, but doesn't want to live with anyone right now. And we actually moved him into a small town where housing costs are at least half and as much as a tenth what they are for similar quality houses in the city I live in. So it's about a 45-minute drive to this town. All in all, it's a friendly, nice, pleasant, low-crime town with a moderate amount of work in it, but everything there is substantially cheaper because, again, right now, with housing trends, people want to buy as close to a major urban center as they can, even though the necessity of it is going down almost every year. So now on to things like digital industry. Basically, there are always going to be hard industries, construction, road building, those kinds of things, but there are also a huge number of new industries that are, by their structure, especially when you factor in the internet, non-geographical. So basically anything in academia, anything in science, and anything in the digital industry. So be it internet companies, marketing, app design, game design, entertainment. For some of them, it's convenient for companies of the same industry to be closer together, but none of them need to have their main hubs in one specific place. A good example is Yale is near New York, but it's still a couple hours drive away from New York, and obviously people are still able to do their research from it and only go into New York recreationally, not out of necessity. The same would apply technically for any industry where the product that you sell is digital or informational in nature, and the number of industries that follow this pattern are only growing. So moving to manufacturing. Now this is the one that seems like it could be tricky because, again, what I'm stressing here is locally produced necessities, minimizing shipping whenever the option is there, and keeping all of your businesses local in smaller areas. This seems like it should be hard, but again, I'm talking mostly about technology making it easier, not easiest, and things like 3D printing, computerized CNC machining, and any other kind of automated small batch technology gets a little bit more efficient every couple years. And at the same time, when you look at warehouse costs and shipping costs, might one day actually exceed mass manufacturing in terms of its cheapness. So the best example I can think of for this is actually IKEA with their furniture. They have come in the last couple decades or so to be sort of the furniture and home decor giant of the world. When you look at how they do it, they actually do it by taking a step out of their manufacturing process, right? They build the furniture, but they don't assemble it. They let you walk around in their showroom/warehouse and then take home all their furniture boxed up and packaged to be assembled at home. They save enough money that that's given them a very competitive business model. Now, in the future, when we include automated CNCing, virtual reality, and the cost of shipping given, fossil fuel prices and things like that, what an IKEA in a town of, again, say 100,000 people branch could do would be run a website that, for example, has a VR app on it that lets you explore through a much larger and more diverse showroom than the physical showroom, again, because it has much less upkeep, and even where you could tailor or custom build your room in the VR app, right? You can choose what furniture you want to put in it, you can test layouts, you can walk around, so to speak, in it. And then when you know what you want for your setup, you can basically place an order and then go down the street to an IKEA outlet, which would now be much smaller than any current IKEA warehouse because they would have CNC machines and small automated paint booths on site where they cut your furniture out of lumber that they stock, which again, they don't need as much of, right? Because an IKEA warehouse today does have a fairly large warehouse, but they need to keep all sorts of stuff on hand that they aren't going to sell that day or anytime soon because they need to have one or two of everything that they might sell that day. If you're only keeping your raw materials, or at least partly finished materials, and you can print off furniture in, minutes to hours, then you only need to keep a little bit on hand. You make it when an order is placed, and by the time the person's driven over to pick it up or just waits until the next day to pick it up, then it'll all be ready in there. Again, less needs to be stored, so a cost could be saved there. And again, these technologies will only improve, right? It's probably not many years before every household has a 3D printer in it. Right now, they're kind of finicky and tedious to use and expensive, but they get cheaper every year and more easy to use every year. Plastic goods, there's countless of them, could conceivably be printed much more easily than we could even imagine today, only 10 years from now. And so, with a final step on why this will be easier, again, now and in the future, is computers making logistics easier and small organizations being able to adapt their logistics more quickly. So something I've noticed kind of through my early adulthood in Canada is that anytime you have to deal with the federal government, it takes an unreasonably long amount of time. Basically, they still run on post. All of their paperwork is processed by hand, and because of the size of an organization they are extremely slow to actually adopt any new management technology, not only because it'd be more costly in total for them to adopt it, but they need to train more people in it. And quite frankly, there's not a huge gain in them firing a bunch of employees when, their money comes from taxes. But that's a bit of an aside. Basically, if you had town governments and state governments having more autonomy and by default from that more responsibilities, that won't be as hard as it sounds when we consider that they would be more suited than any other kind of governance to adopt more modern logistical techniques. Somewhere where I actually saw this kind of in practice but not properly implemented yet was actually when I was living in Germany. You deal mostly with the city government for things like residence and immigration issues. If you're there on a student visa, you deal with the town and not with the federal government concerning where you live and those kinds of things. Now, in some ways, they were still living in the 20s, because you had to mail everything to the post office. But at the same time, I have a hard time blaming that on their town government when their banks, that's private banks, also only worked by mail. You could, in some instances, call them and deal with them in person, but anytime you wanted to make a change, they wanted a signed letter mailed to them. Doing it in person seemed to bother them, and doing it over the phone or online was impossible. So it might be more of a regional thing that when it comes to adopting the internet, Germany, of all places, given what we expect of them for manufacturing, seems to be sort of behind in particular. Now, with that aside, basically, I'll just summarize this, why it's easier section. Basically, we have easy communication, more digital industry, easier local manufacturing, and computers making local logistics easier. So basically, when we visualize this kind of future that I'm trying to describe, the main difference is just more people live in smaller towns and local governments are proportionately more influential and occupy a bigger role in their lives in people's lives relative to federal governments than they do now. And I don't think this is something we can get by voting for it in federal politics. because obviously if you ask them to do something for you, that will sort of set it in stone that they're the people to manage it. The way to do it's just moving to smaller towns and engaging in more community activity over there, which again should happen naturally with the seed sown, so to speak, of people moving to these smaller towns in the first place. So if any of this has sold you at all, or if you already had this kind of plan in mind, again, this channel largely markets to outdoorsy people and, oddball alternative philosopher types. So, you've probably heard these kinds of ideas before about decentralization and that kind of thing. I'd like to move on to a little bit of a plan that I'm trying to get up and started to kind of make this happen. Personally, I think it'll happen naturally anyways once we sort of get this show on the road. So if you want to hear a little bit more about the plan and how this would all happen, 2 videos I'd recommend on the topic would be either It's Time for a New Social Network or The Difference Between Recreation and Entertainment. In the meantime, thanks for watching.